And I now look to Judy Cheng-Hopkins to close the case for the opposition.
Thank you. Mr. President, all movements for social justice are necessarily protracted. The feminist movement is no different. In the USA, I would say it has had a 150-year history, starting with the Civil War in 1861. Now, as you know, the Civil War represented very turbulent times in the US history. Turbulent in the sense that the country as we know it today had to decide whether to remain one unified nation, one strong union, or whether to keep slavery legal or to abolish it altogether. So at times like this, strong leaders emerge. We have the Harriet Tubmans. Harriet Tubman, a poor black woman, who risked her life to aid slaves escape to Canada and elsewhere through the so-called Underground Railroad. Susan B. Anthony, a white woman, early suffragette, who was an organizer at the grassroots level to abolish slavery. These were the early feminists. Then, through history, we had the suffragettes movement of the 1890s, and then we had the Equal Rights Amendment movement in the early 1900s, and then the iconic 60s with the Gloria Steinems of the world. Gloria Steinem, who started the Ms. Foundation, Ms. Magazine, and in fact, I think that's when the term Ms. was coined. So these were the strong waves of feminist movement. What's interesting in America is that in parallel with the feminist movement was the other great social justice movement of the day, the movement or the fight for racial equality, the so-called civil rights movement. So one would ask, since these movements existed in parallel, did they cooperate, did they work together, or were they separate? I would say that there were moments of great cooperation and great convergence when the leaders had common visions. They saw common goals and overlapping needs and priorities, and they felt that if they worked together, they could achieve greater results. And so it was, because when they worked together, the outcomes in America were phenomenal. We have all these, we had the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we have equal pay for equal work. You can list all the laws and the acts that were passed when the movements worked together. I think the best way to picture this is to picture Gloria Steinem hand in hand with Angela Davis, a leader of the Black Panther movement, hand in hand, fists in the air, and chanting the same tune. Now, they were not always, that way, hand in hand. But in the end, they saw the common interest and the common good, and I think Gloria Steinem calls Angela Davis the original feminist from whom we can learn. So there were moments of great convergence, but also moments of divergence, and some have already mentioned, and this happened as recently as January 21st of this year when the Women's March against Trump collided with the Black Lives Matter movement. The Women's March against Trump obviously was in response to his crude remarks and actions against women, obviously to mirror anti-women policies. The Black Lives Matter march was about black men and women protesting the cruel treatment by the police against black people. Now, they collided, as I said in January, with the Black Lives Matter movement accusing the women of being middle-class, white, elitist women who didn't empathize with their cause. And I think one placard in the Black Lives Matter movement says it best. It says, "You nice white women, why don't you come to my march?" So I think that epitomizes the so-called divergence. So what is it? Was there a convergence? Was it more convergence and less divergence, or what? And I came across a paradigm, a framework developed by Professor Charles Hamilton of Columbia University, the co-author of the book Black Power. He co-authored the book with Stokely Carmichael. And in it, he presents a very clear paradigm, a framework, with which to analyze this phenomenon. He says all social justice movements have to go through 3 phases to succeed. First phase being politics of protest, politics of participation, and politics of governance. Now, I would argue that divergence, the so-called divergence between these two groups, happens most during the first phase, the politics of protest, when tensions are high, passions are high, vying for attention from the media. And it would seem natural that they would be that kind of mood, because the idea is to recruit people to your movement. So one had to be very loud about what you stood for in order to recruit other people. So the Black Lives Matter versus the Women's March against Trump, I think, epitomizes this. This was when that divergence was so clear in the protest stage. Now, assuming the protests have been successful, they prevailed, their voices were heard, and the powers that be now invite them to the table. State your grievance. What are your recommendations? What are your ideas to make the world a better place? And they're invited to this table. That's when we have the politics of participation. That's when these various movements actually get to elect representatives to speak on their behalf. And they are sitting around the table and participating. Now, that's when a lot of times these various groups, Black groups, women's groups, see the benefit of coalitions, the benefit of working together, because the social justice that they stand for was so overlapping in so many ways and so common in terms of what they're trying to achieve. So that's when we have the politics of participation and where I think convergence happens the most. And then, of course, the last stage is the politics of governance, when you're lucky enough to be represented, where you're in the legislature, you are in parliament, and you represent your constituency, your groups, and you're now able to govern. You're now able to sit in positions of power so that you can ensure that policies that were enacted, laws that were passed, really do benefit the people they were meant to benefit, and you get to govern. So the politics of protest, participation, and governance by Charles Hamilton, I think, for me, describes very well this whole phenomenon of when the two groups work together and when they seem to be diverging. So I think what I would like to leave you with, Mr. President, is this aphorism. And this aphorism is, a rising tide lifts all boats, even the smallest boats. When we pass a policy, when we pass a law or an act that, so-called feminist initiated, feminist initiatives, they impact not only those feminists, they impact all women. One very good example of an organization under threat today in America is Planned Parenthood of America, originally initiated by feminists, but which has served to provide health care, reproductive rights care, contraception, cancer screening, breast cancer screening, pap smears to women, and especially disadvantaged women. Disadvantaged women who live in regions of America underserved by medical facilities. Now, unlike the UK, there's no such thing as socialized medicine until so-called Obamacare came to being. But as you know, this is all under threat today. But the point here is that when a policy is enacted, initiated by feminists, they tend to serve all women, no matter what color they are. So do I believe then in this motion before us today that feminist movements tend to disregard minority women? Obviously not. Obviously not. I think the statement is actually a false polemic. It's a false polemic, and the truth couldn't be further than that. Thank you very much.